use it or need to adapt it for your own classroom. So that we're going to go through the entire lesson together as though it's in a classroom, and then afterwards we're going to take a step back and not talk about the content, but talk about the structure of the materials and the delivery of that, so that that's going to be a pattern that we repeat throughout the week of doing both, of engaging deeply with the materials, because it really gives you, I think, the best sense of what does this look like, rather than just looking at it or talking about it, but actually to do it, but then to take the step back to reflect on it as practitioners. So that's what we're going to do with a lesson about Lexington. This is a lesson certainly that you would not be teaching at the start of a unit about the American Revolution. This would be after the students had an introduction to the ongoing conflict between the colonists and the British government. This is midway through, so students should have some content knowledge beforehand. We're not going to deliver that to you because you're a group of social studies teachers. So what I'd like to do, though, is to just briefly share out, especially for some of you who may not have been teaching the American Revolution and the lead up to it recently. What do we know about the Battle of Lexington? What a knowledge do folks in the room bring to bear? Are there particular people or phrases or events that you connect to the Battle of Lexington? What do we know? Share out a little bit before we dive into this question. Good, so Sons of Liberty. Can you say a little more about who the Sons of Liberty were?
Sam Adams started it. It was a kind of a group that was against the British policies. They were seen as troublemakers by the British, and they organized a series of, I guess, spies that 12 years involved.
Good, so there was, by this point in 1775, there was a very well organized, or loosely organized in some cases, but there were a lot of committees, correspondence. There are people throughout the colonies who are resisting British rule, and by this point, right, this has been many years in developing of conflict, and there are a variety of leaders of this movement. Good. Other things we know about the Battle of Lexington. Yeah. Good. So there is a phrase "shoppers around the world" associated with this day about the shops being fired, and because it's the beginning of open conflict between the colonists and the British government. And it's not just about American history, but it's also this period of beginning of revolutions around the world, right? And Longfellow writes a poem, right? Good. Other things we know about the Battle of Lexington.
Powder.
Say that again.
Powder.
Say a little more about that.
Massachusetts militias had powder in storage, and the British wanted it.
Good. So the British troops are coming out of Boston, and if you are not as familiar with your Boston geography, Lexington is just a little outside of Boston. It is a suburb now. At the time, it was further out. And so it's a serious walk, right, out there. And the destination was not actually Lexington, but actually Concord. And they go through Lexington to get to Concord. And they believed that that's where there were munitions being stored, and they were going to seize those munitions and perhaps even arrest some of these leaders of this resistance movement. And so they're marching out there. Good. What else?
Paul Revere.
Good. Say, what do we know about Paul Revere?
So Paul Revere was a prominent silversmith in Boston. Definitely had lots of friends, if not was himself one of the Sons of Liberty. Took a famous horseback ride to warn folks out in Concord, the British are coming.
The British are coming. He, along with a few colleagues, are warning people that the British are on the march, so that they are aware of this movement. Good. Anything else we know about this event? Yeah.
On the return, the militias were lining behind the stone walls, and they were picking off the red folks.
Good. So at Lexington, there are shots fired. The colonists die. The British go on to Concord. Things go poorly at Concord. They're forced to retreat, and all the way back to Boston, the American colonists are taking pot shots at them from behind walls, and it's fairly disastrous for the British. Good. Any other details? Yes, Christine.
It's not them who really fired the first shot.
Excellent. So we know that there is this famous shot, but we don't know who fired it, and so we're going to be trying to answer two questions. The big one is, what happened on the Lexington Green on April 19, 1775? And question 1A is going to be, who fired that famous shot? that began the American Revolution in many regards, right? It's the beginning of the open conflict. And we're going to do that. We're going to try to investigate those two questions, the big one and then the sub-question, by looking at a series of documents. The first one we're going to look at is this image of the Green in Lexington on April 19th, 1775. And what I'd like you to do is, with your neighbors, take 2 or 3 minutes and look at this image and use it as a source of evidence to answer those questions of what happened and perhaps who fired the first shot. Before you engage in any deep artistic critique of the color selection or the paint strokes, you can get to that if you like. First start with just what do you see? What evidence can we draw from them? Who is there? What are they doing? What is the setting of this? So take 2 or 3 minutes with your neighbors about thinking about what evidence this provides to answer those questions, and we'll share all together. So 2 or 3 minutes with your neighbors, we'll come back.
Can you check to make sure it's
Of course.
Patriots, great American patriots,
Or rebels, whatever, you know.
evil British.
Yeah.
And I'd like to know when this was painted, because there's clearly an American colonist bias here.
Why do you say that?
Well, because the American soldier's dead right there, and the British guy up on the horse is dictating that the regimented troops are firing on these people.
So there's a little bit of like an underdog.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
but even the perspective of like the painter, right? They're standing on the American side, looking at it from the American side,
Yeah.
watching the British approach, right? And so, like, you know, it's unclear a little bit what they're doing other than like coming in.
Because of the perspective, you also really understand that the colonists are not as, like, their uniforms aren't as
Ragtag.
fancy.
Yeah.
The ragtag army. And opposite of that, you see that the British are on the line, they're very organized, they all look the same, they have a leader. Like, it's just, it highlights the differences.
I think also without showing the British troops, you can't see whether or not anyone's been shot, so it's kind of leading you to assume that the first person shot was an American.
Yeah, it's wild how much this like parallels when you see pictures of like U.S. Army forces invading like Native American towns and shooting everybody. It's like very, like, you know, I don't know.
And there's a famous painting from it's from like the French Indian War, the Pequot War, with the guy who's dead right there. It's this very similar posture, but the British guy's dying. I forget the name of that painting, but the Americans are also the only ones with faces in this painting.
Yes,
So
right.
the British are faceless automatons, kind of like what you were talking about.
Yeah.
But you also, you know, you see the Americans with their guns pointed, and you don't see that in the brothers, like the ones that are marching that you can see, you don't see their guns pointed.
Yeah.
And obviously, there's an American dead on the floor, so somebody shot him, but, you know.
But I'm wondering if that white is supposed to be implying that multiple shots have already come from the British, and so now we're seeing the Americans retaliate.
Sound, right?
Now we can dissect the symbolism of the green.
Yeah.
I don't know what's doing for a minute.
I mean, the line of the painting also is pretty, when you got a diagonal line on it, so it's some action. I don't know, I mean, we've gotten at it. Yeah, I wonder when it was painted, because that matters.
This does a really good job of showing different emotions of the Americans too. Like you have some Americans do it, and then there's a man who's left who's scared. Some people who are just kind of chilling. Like, I think it does a really good job of humanizing the Americans in it.
Canova, have you looked at this thing on the bubble stuff?
It's amazing.
Yeah, y'all gotta use that for the interims and stuff. Oh, you could, like, at least documents and, like, starting point. It's not like, you know, they're not multiple choice questions. It's not the same. I'm gonna pull,
They're more formative. They should be used in class.
like, exit ticket type stuff.
Because it's more assessing, like, do you know how to store? So, like, the one that I always think of is one of the painting of the first Thanksgiving, and it asks the kids, is this a reliable source? And kids should be able to say, like, no, it was painted in 1958 by American. Like there's bias, there's like the changing of history.
What do we see? What evidence?
Oh, I see.
What evidence does this image provide for things to folks see? Start us off. Yeah.
Very little.
Okay.
There's no attribution to it, so we have no idea when it was painted.
Good. So that's an excellent question that we're going to come back to in a moment. Who made this, right? And when? Really important question. What do we see though? What can we see in terms of just what's happening here? Yeah.
We noted that the smoke is all on the British radio side.
Good. So we see
There's a lot.
Good. So there's a lot of smoke over by the British. So we see that there are British soldiers in their distinctive red coats, and it appears as though there's a lot of smoke, which suggests that they have fired. Right. Good. What else? Other things that we see in this image? Yes.
It looks like a European style battle, and then you have guys that sort of just facing each other, just shooting. It doesn't appear to be like a whole lot of hand-to-hand combat.
Good. So yeah. So also suggestive of a particular time and place in terms of the ways in which we engage in battle. Right. That there are these two groups that are lined up, apparently in the middle of a field, that are just shooting at each other. Right.
It's the colonists holding their ground and not really running.
Good. So yeah. So the colonists appear to be holding their ground. This gentleman with his fist defiantly raised. Yeah. So they appear to be fighting the British. Yes.
It appears that there's a couple colonists who have injuries on the militia side. We can't really see any injuries over on the British side.
Good. So there are some colonists down. There's this gentleman here in the front. There's another guy on all the way on the left, and then the person in the mid ground who seems to have just been shot. Arms are up in the air, but there do not seem to be any wounded British as far as we can tell. Yes.
It seems to be from the colonists' point of view. I mean, from behind them, you can see sort of more emotion or on those people, then you can't see anything. You can't really see faces on the other side.
Yeah, the British are almost faceless, right? The only British figure who's sort of clearly defined is this seemingly the officer who is apparently very close to the colonists. Strange positioning, in my less than professional opinion. But yeah, so good point though that the British are faceless. In contrast, we really see the emotions of these colonists. There's the defiant fist. There's this other gentleman who's really standing strong against the British. Yes.
And I didn't know if they put like Kern up in the front to say like he's giving, because I don't think they would shoot unless they were ordered to, that he is giving the order.
Good, so we have a hypothesis being put forth here that the British officer is indeed ordering the British soldiers to fire at the colonists. Yes?
It seems that, although there are numerous colonists, that the British greatly outnumber them. So you have the British in the mid-ground, but if you look behind near the tops of trees, there's a whole nother.
Good, so really nice eye. If you see, look all the way over to the right-hand side behind the British officer, there's a whole nother line. So it appears as though there's a very large British fighting force, and although we see some colonists, it seems as though the colonists are outnumbered. Next. Anything else? Other things people noticed in this? Yes?
Like our physical perspective is we're on the colonist side. Like we're looking at the colonist.
Good, so in terms of thinking about who made this and why, we're thinking about what was the artist trying to do in that regard, because we're certainly positioned with the colonists. Can we, yeah, go ahead.
The colonists are all clad in uniforms that are identical with green.
Good, so the colonists, well, I don't know if they're all the same. They are these sort of deep green colors, right? Whereas the British are these very bright, beautiful uniforms, and the colonists look a little more ragtag, right? Where is this located? What is happening here, or where is it happening? Do we have any sense of a location for this event? What do we see about location? Yeah.
Well, it's supposed to be Lexington green, but so the idea is that you've kind of got that sort of large public space.
Good.
But the buildings in the background don't look like anything in Lexington, so
wondering about that, so we have brings perhaps some background knowledge to it, but that there's a green here in the middle, and that there are buildings, right? And they look fairly substantial, right? That there appears to be two-story buildings. One of them has two chimneys. This is not in the middle of the wilderness, right? That this is indeed, as we surmise with the question about what happened in the Lexington Green, this is the Lexington Green. We're in the middle of a town. Good. Do we have solid evidence to answer the question of what happened, or more importantly, do we have evidence about who fired the first shot? Not particularly, right? There's not the best evidence about who fired the first shot from this one. We have some evidence about what happened. But in history, we don't want to accept a single source as evidence of what happened in the past. We want to look at multiple sources. So we're going to look at a second image. What I'd like you to do is the same thing with your neighbors. Take 2 or 3 minutes, look at this second image, and again, looking for evidence that we can use to answer those questions of what happened, and perhaps who fired the first shot. What is the evidence that this image would provide to answer those questions? 2 or 3 minutes with your neighbors, then we'll share back all together. Feel free to stand up also to see kids.
What are just disorganized?
Yeah.
So you have the organization of the British, but then the chaos and disorganization of the colonists.
Yeah.
I just really know it.
Again, you have all that smoke around the British, right? That's like
Yeah.
implying that they're firing those shots. You know, whether it was the first one or the second one, that they shouldn't fire those.
And that there are more coming from that side.
Looks like it's much more. I would guess it was created much more immediately following the event because it's not nearly as stylized, and it's a little sort of the composition's a little simpler, so it might have run in the newspaper or something. Which would, I mean, that's just a guess, but also.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, it also portrays the colonists as much less organized
Yeah.
than the other painting.
And even more outnumbered. You can see the British troops all along the end.
It's also like the perspective, right? The first one to do this clearly like standing right by the colonists, and this one is like from up on a hill or something, where even the artist and stuff imagine that they're both actually present, right? That this artist is gonna be able to see more instead of just like in the weeds and not be able to see what was going on.
And because of the perspective, the colonists look more cowardly, like they're running away. They're not confronting
away.
it like they were in the other painting. But the setting is pretty similar.
Yep.
Yeah, the
terms of the
buildings and all that.
In the distance.
And you still have the officer doing pretty much the same thing.
On horseback.
Yeah.
I mean, this is one of those places where that like corroboration piece or whatever, you know, comparing like what do we see that's happening in both paintings, like maybe those are the things we can trust a little more, you know. That's important.
It also looks like the British are heading in 2 different directions. Like there's one's going through the middle of the field, but it almost looks like
They're
outside and
encircling
going somewhere else.
They're probably coming around the bank
Or going for
yeah.
the militia or whatever that they were colonists are defending. Nothing.
Look how many people we have behind now. Look how organized we are. Yeah.
All the buildings look the same too. Like you still have that double chimney building.
The ground just looks different.
Yeah. It's funny, I went to Canada last year and I was up in St. Catharines, which is by Toronto over on the East Coast, and the local high school, the mascot was the Redcoats, and so they kept talking about how great the Redcoats were and all this stuff. I'm sitting there, I'm like, wait, what? I've never heard that before in my life. Yeah.
That's funny.
What do you mean Redcoats? Oh wait, we're in Canada. They were given their independence. Never mind.
That's really funny.
Yeah.
Can you imagine that being a school mascot? Wow.
Like a British culture, they
No, I haven't. Maybe I can try.
Was that?
I can't.
A day with the course about discussions would be cool.
Huh?
The day with I think on Wednesday talking about
Yes,
discussions, that'll be
very
really
much looking
helpful.
forward to that.
Yeah. So that's definitely hard.
All right, let's come together, please. So before we engage in any comparison across images, let's just start with this second one. What do we see in this second image? What are some of the things that we see? What are some of the evidence that we can draw for trying to answer these questions? Or what happened? And perhaps we fire the first shot. What are some of the things that folks see in this second?
The colonists are running.
Good. So in contrast to standing tall, defiantly raising fists, they are fleeing the scene. So yes, they appear to be running off the screen, right? A very different depiction of the colonists. Good. Other things that we see in this second one. Yes.
A lot of smoke coming from the British.
Good. So once again, we see smoke coming from the British troops. Appears as though they have fire shots.
We got tons of British.
And we see even more British, right? In this one, we see rank after rank of British troops coming into town. Good. Cheryl, do you have another comment?
I was just going to say what she just said.
Okay, got it. Good. Other things people notice, yes?
In terms of timing, just to be more close to the event.
So we have a hypothesis being put forth that perhaps this one is painted more close to the time of the event. And we're going to get that information very shortly. So we're wondering about timing again, a really important question. Yeah.
No actual evidence that the colonists engaged in battle at all. There are no, I can't see any British casualties. The postures of the colonists, the way they're holding their guns, it doesn't seem like they've engaged in combat at all.
Good, so we're not sure there was a fight here. There are no British wounded. Do we see any wounded colonists? Yeah, so once again, there's evidence that the colonists have been shot here. And so there are colonists on the ground. It seems like even more than the previous image. Good. Other things we see, other things we notice. Yes?
The officer is assuming pretty much the same posture, and looks like he's doing pretty much the same thing like he was in the other painting.
Good, so once again we see that it appears as though the British officer is directing his troops in some way. His orientation seems a little more sensible in terms of how close he is to the British. But yeah, so there's once again this British officer or we are assuming he's an officer, seems to be directing his troops. Nice. Yeah, so we're noticing here that the buildings seem to be the same, right? We can see there's the same building on the left there with the two chimneys, and then a second large building with the broad roof. In the second image, we can see some additional buildings as well. Other things that are similar or different across these two images that folks noticed or discussed. Yes?
So we were discussing that the first image was probably from the point of view of the colonists, very sympathetic, they're very clear. The British are fairly faceless. In the second one, though, we were thinking that even though it looks like it's from the point of view of the colonists, it possibly could have been produced by the British to show the disarray of the colonists and to show the strength of the British as sort of a warning. This is what you're up against. You need to get in line.
Good, so hypothesis about what might be the intent of the second author, whereas the first one seems to be from the perspective of the colonists. Do we have any better evidence about who fired the first shot? No. Not really. No, not particularly. But there's this big outstanding question that was raised from the very beginning, this crucial question to ask of who made these and when. So let's get that information on the table. So the first image is from 1886. It is made by a gentleman named Henry Sandham. Sandham is commissioned by the Lexington Historical Society to create an image commemorating the events on the green in 1775. I grew up in a neighboring town to Lexington. We played Lexington High School in sports. Their mascot is the Minuteman. There is a vocational high school in town. It is Minuteman Vocational High School. And every third and eighth Monday in April is Patriots Day. The state of Massachusetts takes it off. They run a marathon, and there is a very large reenactment of the Battle of Lexington. I have bad memories. My parents were waking me up in the pre-dawn darkness to go watch it, and lots of people show up. All of which to say, Lexington takes their history very seriously, and they did in 1886 as well, and so they paid Sandham to make this painting. The second image is from 1775. It is made by a guy named Amos Doolittle. He is a silversmith. He's from Connecticut. He's a member of another militia, and after the events at Lexington and Concord, there are militias that are called up to Boston and Cambridge because there's a belief that there's going to be much more fighting between the British and the colonists. However, there isn't. The British go across the river, they're in Boston, and Doolittle and his militia from Connecticut are hanging out on the green in Cambridge. They get bored. Doolittle and a friend walk out to Lexington and Concord They interview people who were present for the events at Lexington and Concord, and his friend makes a few paintings, and then Doolittle makes this engraving and several others. It is the most well-known image from the time of the events, but Doolittle was not there himself, but he speaks to people who were. Given this information, does it change the way you think about these documents as sources of evidence about what happened at Lexington and perhaps who fired the first shot? Take just 2 minutes with your neighbors. How does this information change the way you think about them? If so, how?
Neither of them were there, right? So like, even though they're historical documents, they're also like secondary source because neither of them are a witness to it, right?
But there still is more reliability with Doolittle because of the fact that he directly interviewed people.
Yeah.
It was closer to the time period.
100%.
Physically there.
100%. And I think what you were saying about the first painting before, that like that's like from the perspective of the colonists, you could tell that it was like painted afterwards. Like that's clearly with a purpose in mind to like celebrate them about this. Yeah.
What was Doolittle's purpose?
He was a member of the militia.
But
So
so what?
maybe to give a reason to militias and other colonies to come and join the battle up north.
Would that painting make you want to join the
This one,
colonists?
no, the one on the bottom.
Yeah.
But if
No, it wouldn't.
But if
But
you're, but
it
if
would
you're a
justify.
soldier,
It would
you're in a
justify
militia already, right?
Yeah.
So you know you're fighting, and so this is like your call to action. Like, holy shit, we
firing
need
upon
more men.
innocents.
And like this could just be historical documentation, like the same reason that people like journal or like whatever, you know, a record of like what happened.
It could be, but then someone could argue that about like Paul Revere's engraving of the Boston Massacre, which portrayed a very similar scene, and it really spoke to the American people. So like, I wonder if both of these are in a way just propaganda, and like neither of them is really giving us.
Did he say anything about if this Amos Doolittle one was published?
He said it was one of the most widely known or seen images of the conflict.
I mean, I would imagine that. I think you said that to get other militias to join and like get an act of propaganda, like because if you're in a militia and you're a soldier and you're fighting for this, that's like this is the call to action, call to arms. Like we need you.
Yeah.
The British are coming. They're gonna fuck us up. Look how many soldiers are in this picture, ready to shoot us. You know.
Especially because how differently the Revolutionary War progressed in different parts of the country. Like especially like in the South, for example, the Revolutionary War was completely different than it was in New England. So like I'm sure they're trying to do everything they can to get people to come up and help out.
I think like in terms of his question of does this information help us get any closer to knowing who exactly shot it, I don't think so. I think these are told from the same perspective with the same bias and in many ways like with a similar purpose.
And like again, neither of them were there, so it's all like stories of what you heard and what people said, and not necessarily like.
I like how they presented it though, and it gives you sort of you kind of assume a false equivalency. Like I assumed anyway. The second one was a British perspective, and you're kind of. It's interesting how presenting that in the classroom you can kind of you make those.
All right, let's come back together again, please. What do we think? Does this crucial source information change the way that you think about these documents? I see some nodding heads. How do we think about these documents differently now that we have the source information attribution? Yes.
Amos Doolittle painted it right at the same time that it was happening. So in interviewing other people, he's going to get some more raw emotion, I suppose. 100 years later, history's had a chance to be interpreted by that time, so that perspective is going to be different.
Okay, so, but not necessarily that. There's sort of just there's some actually. So they get, if I understand correctly, there are some strengths to both documents. On the one hand, Doolittle had access to people who were there and could tell them about what took place. On the other hand, he also doesn't have a broader perspective, right? He wasn't speaking to the British troops, for instance, right? Given his position as a member of the militia. In contrast, by 1886, Sandham has a much clearer vision of what transpired, right? Or at least has access to more information about what took place than
I think that's even in one of your shade lessons, if I'm not mistaken. There was something about that was written at the time
is something that's written about a lot later, so we talk to the kids about, they always get, well, this has to be right over here because it was written at the time. It's like, well, you don't really know all the facts of what happened. All you can say is, oh my God, we had this.
What happened, right? So thinking about the sort of relative strengths and weaknesses of documents. Good. Other things about these documents and how we think about them differently. Yes.
Although they both have biases potentially from the opponent's side, the Doolittle is really more maybe reporterly. He's got eyewitnesses. He would probably be a little more raw about it. Versus the second one, which is they're writing about a legend. They're writing into the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere legend.
Good. So, idea that Sam, in some ways, the glorified vision of what took place there, trying to, that it seems unlikely the Lexington Historical Society would have been very happy if he had painted a painting in which all the Minutemen were running off of the green, right? That's not what they would have wanted, right? So there's also something, who's the audience and what was their mission? Yes?
But then again, with Doolittle, knowing his bias, and he's making an engraving. It's not like he's making a historical document for somebody to look at. He can be making a propaganda piece, just like Revere did 5 years earlier with the Bloody Massacre engraving.
So say a little bit about what Doolittle...
Is that engraving supposed to be a propaganda piece? I mean,
so,
why is he doing that?
Yeah, so play that out though. What might he be trying to do if this is propaganda? What might be the purpose
He's trying to show that the British have come with an overwhelming force. You have a few brave people trying to stand up and they're being slaughtered.
Good, so a different perspective could be that it's important to remember that in 1775, there has not been a decision to go to war with Great Britain, right? That there is an open conflict within the colonies about what should be the future. And his theory has a clear perspective. He's joined a militia, and so perhaps this is an effort for him to rally others to his side, to say that look at the way in which we have been treated by the British. That's one way we could interpret it, right? Good, yes?
I could be wrong, but were engravings used with the idea of being able to print them over?
Yeah, absolutely, right. So the notions of what would this be done, and that there are all these broadsheets, being produced at the time, so the notion that this would be distributed is quite likely, right? Yeah, absolutely.
Another point that we were thinking about, in 1886, the Civil War was still relatively recent, and so, this kind of glorifies the unity of the nation and how we fought together.
Yeah, so thinking about a different contextualization of thinking about the context of 1886, and then in some ways this may also be a product of trying to have a slightly rosier image of our history in contrast to the deep divisions and bloodshed of the 20 years before, right? Good, nice, really interesting take. Anything else in terms of ways we think about these documents differently given the attribution? Oh, yes, you're in that.
If I were building document sets, what I want to do, I would probably throw out the salmon one, because it just serves a different purpose. To incorporate the Doolittle as an engraving from like one perspective, and then try and bring in similar sources. And especially if I could find myself a report, a letter, something of the British officers like counting.
Good, you're not a plant, but that's what we're going to look at in 30 seconds. And then we're going to go to Leslie's idea of a document from British officers.
So I don't have a historical background, I have a literary background, but when I look at these two, I want the kids to see both of them to talk about author's purpose, because that's such a translatable skill even into current affairs and whatnot. Why, for what purpose were these created, and how did the similarities and differences between them support the author's purpose?
Good, yes, so absolutely. We want to think about what's the perspective and what are they trying to achieve here? Yeah, without a doubt. And I think the point is well taken from Leslie is that we still don't really have a good answer to our big questions of what happened and even who fired the first shot, and that we've raised some real questions about the reliability of these. So let's look at a written source. So this is a document from a British officer. Please just read document A for right now. So just the document A, and then chat with your neighbors about how it helps you to answer those questions. What happened and perhaps who fired the first shot. So just document A, and then we will look at document B after we've debriefed A.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Just Dave for now. Anybody not get one? Anybody need? Once you get a chance to reach out to chat with your neighbors about. Yeah, just document.
And so one of the first things I see is
It's funny how this portrays the British as like fairly disorganized and like not under orders or under any sort of control and kind of like a hot mess, which is not the American interpretation.
Yeah.
But then you also gotta consider like these American militiamen, like what are y'all doing standing in the middle of the comments? Like this a poor, I don't know anything about military strategy, and I know that's a poor military strategy, right? Like you just standing there, you know, open easy targets.
Yeah.
And so it just, like, I think highlights the lack of military experience of a lot of these people. And even the British are comparatively well organized, but you can't hear orders, aren't given any orders, massacre a crowd of people after one or two shots simply because there's no clarity on, like, what to do in that situation.
Well, I thought it was interesting that they never described the colonists as a troop or any sort of military language with it.
Yeah.
It was always like there was a group gathered together. They were intending to oppose us. Like, yeah, it was just a group of people standing around. Like, they're not even described as being equal to the British in any sort of way in terms of their military experience.
I wonder, because we have so many sources that are diaries from soldiers or captains or I don't know, whatever the word is. Anyway, are those diaries intended to be read by people when they're written at the time of the event? Or do people just write diaries because it's fun? Like when I write a diary, it's not for posterity. I'm not going to write anything that like makes me look any better than I really am.
Yeah.
It's for me.
Well, that's why they're so trustworthy, right? The diaries as historical
But that's,
resources.
I wonder though, like, is that the purpose of the diary of a lieutenant in a British army, or are they intended to write diaries so they can use them as like?
Well, I would think about
logs
like
of what happened.
think about like people today, maybe people who have like blogs or whatever about politics or something like that. You know, even if it's like more personal, like you still hope that whatever you're putting forth is like historically accurate for like posterity's sake or whatever. You know, like I would imagine, but I don't know. Like even if I journal about like a protest I go to, I don't think anyone's ever gonna read that, but I still make an effort to make sure that it's like accurate and I'm like describing things as I saw it, and it's not just for you know the public to read, but your progeny. You know what I mean? Like 2 generations later, my grandkids or whomever.
But I wonder if they had that perspective at the time. And I wonder what the practice of writing diaries was within these groups.
Yeah.
I don't know what military diaries.
Like the line "without any orders fired and put them to flight" is what kind of raised a red flag for me, because this like relieves the British of guilt. They did not order to shoot the Americans. Things just got crazy and there was shooting that happened, rather than the British marched in neat rows to the commons and then systematically killed Americans.
Without discipline.
Yeah, but the date, I don't think they're worried about guilt, especially with this like adversary degree. Right, and also like as a military man, you wouldn't want to be like, we were a hot mess and disorganized and nobody gave any orders and we didn't know what to do. But like that, you know, I think in that moment, if the Americans shot first, they would be 100% justified in ordering their men to shoot back, right? This, I don't think, paints the British in a particularly favorable light. I don't know what the incentive would be because, they still would be guilt-free if the Americans shot first if they had given the order to retaliate. You know?
It's much more humanizing. Like it's just, people were walking and then they got shot at, someone shot back, and then
it's like just this like mob of, yeah.
Huh. If anything, it's condescending toward the troops because it said they were so wild they couldn't hear any orders. Like you were saying, they were terrible. They completely undisciplined. And then now you're fighting a war that it takes you 4 months to get supplies to.
But I think they've also learned their lesson of being portrayed as a highly organized group of people killing civilians with the Boston Massacre. And so, I can see his first reaction to be like, "Ooh, it's totally not like that. Let's hurry up and get that information out."
Yeah, but I mean, this wasn't published at the time, right? It was just in his diary, right? It's not like
maybe he's trying to convince himself.
Yeah. It reminds me of the Hamilton song. Let's tell the story. Do you like Hamilton?
I haven't seen it. I'm a terrible history teacher, I know.
Do you listen to the music?
I'm a terrible history teacher.
What's your homework tonight?
They'll tell the story of tonight, like that perspective. I don't think that's actually how they felt of like,
Alright,
let's
reconvene.
And I don't know if that's necessarily what that was. This is a historical.
What does Lieutenant John Barker provide us in terms of trying to answer this question of what happened and perhaps who fired the first shot? What is his account?
Rebels fired first, and the men just started firing without orders, basically because they were being fired at.
Good, so two important details being raised here. One, we have our first direct evidence about who fired first, right? Barker says it was definitely the colonists who fired first. And then importantly, Barker also says, I didn't tell them to fire. They were firing without orders. So an interesting detail. What do people make of that? And why is he saying that his men fired without orders?
Yeah, it's consternating against his own troops. He's like, these guys are so undisciplined. How could they not? Why didn't they wait for me?
Good. So he seems to be throwing his troops under the bus a little bit. The bus that didn't exist in 1775. Why though is he saying his men are totally out of control? Yeah.
I just have another question though. Who's the audience for the if this is a personal diary?
Great. Really important question. So what do we think about that? What do folks think about who's the potential audience of this document?
It feels less diary, like, oh, your diary stands, on the crush, than this is the record being have to read.
Good, so creating a record, and so it's a really crucial issue that especially students, if we say diary, are absolutely going to think of your diary and the injustices of the playground. But if we have a different frame, we think that perhaps he's trying to create a record of what happened. Potentially, why might he be doing that? Because we're not sure, right? We don't know for certain who the audience is. But what's a potential reason why he might want to have a record of this? Go ahead.
CYA, just doesn't want to get in trouble. He's gonna go now to his, up above and say, yeah, this thing was a disaster and it's not my fault.
Good. So we think there may be a little effort to cover his hiney here. That this is important to remember that this is a terrible day at the office for Lieutenant John Barker, right? They started marching at 2 o'clock, and that is not in the afternoon, right? That's in the morning. And from my memories myself of going to the reenactment at very early hours, they started very early. They walked through through the water. They are cold and it's wet. And then what happens is that there are shots fired. And important to remember in 1775, these are British citizens who they are shooting at, right? And so they have just killed British citizens, right?
He can cover them to the point where he's literally like, hey, it's not my fault the shots. And then afterwards, he's still covering, saying, hey, my guys are out of control. So he's covering himself twice on it.
Right, I didn't order and they were out of control.
Yeah.
Okay, so an interesting hypothesis about that he is trying to protect himself, yes.
I mean, he also talks about 2 and 300, which is a very different picture than what we're seeing here.
Nice, so neither Sand nor Doolittle makes it seem as though there are 200 or 300 colonists assembled in the Greek, but Barker says that there is a huge number of colonists there. Good, another interesting detail. They're here, and then here, and then here.
He's also doing it, assuming at the end of this day, and the day didn't get any better after this. They didn't get John Hancock. They didn't make the arrests they were trying to make. They didn't get the gunpowder and the munitions they were trying to get. They were run out of, they were dogged all the way back. And so
So the day only got worse, right? As the day goes on, and so at best,
like
he's doing
terrible,
this
very
at
bad,
the end of a
horrible,
very
whatever.
long bad day, if he even did it that day, right? Or he's just writing down what happened on the 19th at some later date, also possible. So we're here, and then here, and then here.
Yeah, so if you look at, he wrote that it's on the 19th, and they start at 2 o'clock. The whole march starts with them wading through a stream up to their middle. So they're already miserable. They get there, there's 200 or 300 people waiting for them, but it took them 3 hours to get through the stream and into town upon them to finally get there. They get fire spawn, they chill out for a bit, and then they go to Concord, and it hits the fan there.
And then they have to go all the way back to Boston, right? Yeah, 17 miles. And being Harry the whole time. Yeah, so really not a very good pleasant day, right? Disaster. Yeah.
Another contradiction I saw is that implied when they said that the 200 or 300 formed, that there was some organization and plan on the colonist part, and that's a contradiction to both of those.
Good. So it does not, in neither case, even when they are standing solidly in the sand image, they don't seem terribly well organized, right? In contrast to the British. Nice.
I was just going to add that the Boston Massacre has also laid down a legal precedent for if you don't fire first, you'll get off.
Good. So again, some context. We're talking 1770. British fired on colonists, and they are put on trial. The British troops are put on trial there. So that piece of context is really important, and the notion of who was firing, who was ordering was crucial there. And so very likely, or at least possible, that Barker is influenced by those events, right? Of the other instance in which British troops have killed American colonists very close by, right? So and the defense that was used by the troops there in an effort to get off may have shaped what he is saying here. Other things we notice about that, are there particular words or ways in which Barker has written this that stuck out to people? Yeah.
I thought it was interesting that they had to wait a considerable time there. So what does that imply, that they had to be organized?
Good. So he says, right, we waited with some difficulty, and then at length proceeded our way to Concord next. So why are they doing that? Good. Other things that you wondered about? Yeah.
Hannah actually pointed out that this British officer doesn't refer to the militiamen as a militia, but more as just like this crowd of people or this like protest type thing, but not as an actual militia. And I thought that was interesting compared to the language we use, or even what you see in these pictures of like armed men and all that.
Nice. So also important to think about in the context of 1775 at the time, these were just a bunch of sort of rabble-rousers who are on the green, right? This wasn't the American Revolution, right? This was a bunch of troublemakers, right? Nice. Yeah. A nice read there. Good.
I was going to say, he made it clear, too, that there was no intent to attack them.
Good. So he says very clearly, though, right? So a nice note there, a close read. He says, keeping prepared against an attack, though without intending to attack them, right? So saying, we're marching out, we all have guns, and we're in the middle of the night going out there, but we weren't intending to attack them. That's not our intent. So of trying to establish intent there as well. Yeah, Christina.
I think he really shows the British as being very beleaguered. You know, we're cold. It would be read by commanding officers, and like, we're freezing. It's cold. These people attacked us. It's sort of, he shows them as being sort of the weaker, attacked.
Good. So right, that they had been the ones who were set apart. Nice. Well, let's look at another document flip over, document B, we now have a columnist perspective. So take a couple minutes, read the status of your neighbors, and we'll reconvene all together.
Like to the letter. That's it right there.
Once they saw our backs,
I think this one's a little different because it's the court testimony of people trying to not be hanged for treason. So they go out of their way to make sure that all of their ducks are in a row, they're all of age to have guns, they all live there, and they were all running away and got shot in the back. So,
But it still says to our knowledge, right? Like, not a gun was fired by any person in our company on the British soldiers to our knowledge before they fired on us. Just reminds me of, like, even, like, protest accounts now. Like, for example, the Baton Rouge protest last year, right? Like, I was there, right? Like, I could testify, like, I didn't see any protesters doing any of these things. Like, the cops just marched on us out of nowhere with tanks. But, you know, like, the other perspectives, like, their side of the story, like, it's our perspectives are limited, right? Like, to my knowledge, it's all horseshit that what the cops said and what was in the papers and stuff like that. But it's still like this limited perspective of like you still only have 32 militiamen saying like to our knowledge we really didn't fire first, and they believe that, and that may very well be the truth. But I think it's just kind of like the challenge of if you're there in the moment, you still can only see whatever one person can see, right? And like, I think that's why it's so hard to establish like who really did fire that first shot, or in those protests, like, was there any protesters who did do anything? Like, to our knowledge, no, but it's like hard to establish convincing evidence unless you have every single person presenting on the same page.
But their motivation here is that they're presenting to the justice of the peace, who were British.
Right, so you said they're avoiding, trying to avoid being hanged for treason.
How do we know that?
well, the justice of the peace would be, I think it'd be a judge.
And it's still
in a colonial court.
1775.
Yeah, it's still
So it's colonial.
It's still set up by King. And it's days later. Was another thing I noted. So 6 days later that they give this testimony. But I thought one of the parts that was the most interesting is that they said we proceeded towards the green. Like they were just happened to be walking that way. But how are like 34 men just happened to be walking that way with no motivation? But that's what they're trying to present it as. And that like once they had walked in, they're like, oh shit, all these people coming towards us. Then they turn around and leave as they're leaving back. Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know about that.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting too. Of like, once our dudes got to the green, they began to disperse. It's like, well, what y'all went there for then? Like, I'm sure y'all didn't leave the second you got there. And
It's having a picnic at 5 a.m.
And y'all really turned your back to these armed British soldiers? Like, come on now.
And like, not a gun was fired by any person in the company. They had guns to begin with. They were walking, they happened to be walking to this green with their guns. Is that why they say that they're of lawful age?
That's what I think so, yeah.
Okay.
Because, I mean,
I wondered if it was just like that they're 18 and older, like something like that.
I think having a gun then was also much less of a like political or like thing, because everyone had guns because they all were hunters. So.
Take one more minute, then we're going to come together.
And they're called like some of our men, so that seems like more organized.
Well, yeah, it suggested that like this is the Sons of Liberty group. This is an organized protest. like, we went for a reason.
Yeah.
We do have guns. We are meeting up in this spot. Some of us got there early. Some of us got there late. Like, not quite sure what to do when they see the British actually are right there.
Yeah.
And like, if they really did turn their backs, it's probably to like figure out like, what do we do, you know? Conference, huddle up. I know. It's great though.
It's also more middle school style.
Get together and get up the
Like in high school, do you have your kids annotate?
Well, like, they're supposed to annotate stuff, but I don't dictate exactly how they annotate, you know, partly because, like, I hate rules like that. Like, if you told me to annotate a specific way, I tell you, and, like, I wouldn't do it. So, I try to tell them, like, I want you to, this is the question I'm trying to answer.
Does Dr. B provide us to try to answer these questions, and what happened, and perhaps who fired the first shot? What does he say? Or what do they say?
Well, to their knowledge, they did not fire.
Good. So, in important their phrasing, they say, to our knowledge, no one from our side fired a shot, and they say instead, who fired? The British, right? So we now have a he said kind of scenario where the colonists are claiming that the British fired first, and the British have claimed that the colonists are firing first. Yes?
You might take it a step further too and said that the British fired while the colonists had their backs turned.
Good. So yeah, so he both says, and he uses his lawyerly language to say, to our knowledge, nobody on our side fired, and then claims that the British were firing at their backs, right? So making them seem even more aggressive and perhaps dishonorable in terms of the way in which they are engaging in this fight. Good, yes?
They also continually firing, noticing that they're obviously retreating. Because
Good.
it says they continued fleeing their escape.
Good, so they were continuing to be fired at as the colonists were fleeing the sea, which seems more like the Doolittle document. Good. Other things that the Mulligan document provides. Yes, we'll go right across here. 1, 2, 3, 4. Starting with you. Yes, you're up. Yes, back up.
I think it's interesting to note that it's sworn testimony as well. It's not a diary, it's not, an engraving, but it's sworn testimony before justice.
Good, so they've taken some sworn testimony, which all things being equal, we might think is a little more trustworthy because they have sworn an oath to say that they're going to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, or something along those lines. Nobody has ever sworn while under oath before. That's never happened. No president has done that. So yes, but important to point out that they're really different types of documents, right? That one is sworn testimony, that the other one is a diary. We also might want to ask some questions about who are the justices of the peace? Why are they giving sworn testimony, right? So I think those are all important questions. Let's go around here, Kevin.
Also mentions that a number of our men were instantly killed and wounded, kind of suggesting like, this one soldier possibly through the border.
Good, so we have a sense of firing all at once, perhaps, right? And we would make an inference there. Good. Andrew, you also pick it up.
So we also just see the disarray is very much in this one. Some of us were already there, some of us were leaving, some of us were coming. Like, there isn't a lot of organization, and even with 34 different perspectives in this one testimony, there isn't like a pretty clear narrative happening.
Good, so we have a sense of some real chaos that might seem a little bit more like Doolittle's depiction than the others. Leslie, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, so the 34 people coming up with the exact same story is interesting.
Say a little bit more about what you're thinking that it's interesting.
So it feels like collusion. We all sat in the room and we all decided, here's our story.
Good, so it seems a little convenient that 34 people all have the exact same story about a chaotic event that happened in the pre-dawn darkness.
And so it makes you wonder at the time, was that considered, especially swearing before just peace and the whole notion of swearing and taking an oath. Is it more believable at the time that 34 people could possibly, the idea of, we all 34 thought the same exact thing and we swear this together like, we band of brothers?
Good, so question of 34 is better than 1. On the other hand, questions being raised about did they all get together to get their story straight in the intervening days, right? This is dated April 25th, right, instead of the 19th, right? Susan, did you have a hand also?
Yeah, but I may think there isn't information before, but it sounds like it just happened, but why would there be that many people coming and going at 5 o'clock in the morning?
Good, so an important move here is also to say what's not being said. Why, and they don't really seek to say why are all of these guys on the green in the pre-dawn darkness armed, right? We have a sense that there are some weapons here, and so why are they on the green? And they are not saying that, right? They're saying what they want to be stated, which is that they were attacked by the British, right? But they're not talking about why were they there. Good, important detail. Anything else from the Mulligan document? Yeah, here.
Just kind of the odd statement at which time they began to disperse. It's sort of like, why would you all of a sudden just, oh, the troops are here, I guess we'll disperse.
And we'll disperse, right? So again, why aren't they saying a little bit more about what motivates us to do that? Yes.
I was just going to say, it doesn't seem like they were going to the green with any intention to cause any trouble. They just proceeded towards the green.
We just proceeded towards the green, right? They seem to be quite innocent in this engagement.
Just to see what was happening.
Good, yeah, so an interesting dynamic there.
But I think,
Hannah.
I think that goes exactly what they were saying in that corner, this tension in the language between that they were all organized at this time in the morning and they're all going to this place, but at the same time they're trying to present as if it's not organized and that there is no motivation, they just happen to be going. So there's this tension that they're trying to reconcile with this testimony.
Good, so going back and forth between those sort of two dynamics. Over here and then here. Yep.
So it's clear that there was a skirmish on the morning of the 19th, but it really seems like both documents are very aware that the real battle is for public opinion with regard to what actually happened on that field.
Really nice, absolutely, about trying to define the narrative subsequently. Yeah, very well stated. Yeah, Julie.
We were talking a little bit over here. Kyle was mentioning the motivation for this testimony. In 1775, the courts are still run by the British, so these men are trying to avoid a conviction of treason, and so the purpose of all 34 of them banding together with this same story is a self-preservation, and I think that that's going to influence the presentation, and Hannah was talking about the language. Even though they say our men, it's clearly organized. They want to present it as not, so as to avoid,
being in
death
trouble. So I think
sentence or whatever.
in addition to the motivation of trying to set the narrative, they also in some ways had the same CYA motivation as Barker does, in that they just engaged in a firefight with the British Army as British citizens, and that there are potential legal ramifications for that. We're going to pause there because we need to break for lunch in just a little bit. Can we answer this question definitively of who fired the first shot? We can't. And in some ways, that's the purpose of this lesson. We don't want students to walk away with an existential crisis that there is no truth and we can't know anything about what happened in the past, right? However, we also want them to understand that in many ways this is the nature of the discipline, is that there are competing accounts, and we may not be able to know exactly what happened in the past, and that what we can do is mount an argument, right? That I can say, I find Mulligan more believable. There are 34 of them, and that it's sworn testimony, and Barker had a much clearer motivation, and it's just one of them. And so I find that to be more compelling evidence, and so I believe that indeed the British did fire first. I can mount an argument to do that, and that's what historians do. And so that we're giving students a peek into that, because ultimately that's going to be a more telling conclusion to this, is the nature of history and the way in which we construct accounts. However, it's also really important to point out to students that there's a great deal of agreement about a lot of things across these 4 documents, right? They all include the same players, right? That there are British and there are colonists, that it's happening on the green, the timing is the same, that shots are exchanged, the colonists are killed, and the images show the same place, right? So that there is a great deal of agreement, but that there are some things about which we may never know for certain what happened, and that all we are left with are competing accounts and questions. that these documents and these types of inquiries lead to more questions that students should pursue with greater inquiry. That we could go look for more documents. This is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the documentary record about the Battle of Lexington. I might want to go find other documents. I'd like to read some secondary sources. What have historians who spent their careers investigating this? What do they say? And so, but in the process, we've engaged in some real moves of historians, of engaging with evidence and trying to interrogate the evidence in the service of answering these broader historical questions. So we may not have a clear answer to what happened, but more importantly, who fired the first shot. However, the U.S. Postal Service is very clear about what happened, because in 1925, when they issued a commemorative stamp, they used the Sandin image as the representation of what happened at Lexington. So what I'd like to do before we go to lunch is just give you a little taste of where these materials came from, of what is sort of the genesis of them. And it came from research that Sam Weinberg, who is the faculty director of the Stanford History Education Group and a professor at the Graduate School of Education, which is just up the mall from us. And he was actually a graduate student here at Stanford. And when he was a doctoral student, he did research where he asked historians and high school students to read these documents and other documents about the lead up to the American Revolution. And he asked them to think out loud as they read the documents and to articulate their thinking as they engaged with the sources. Before he did that, though, he gave all of them a quiz that was pulled out of the back of a textbook just to get a sense of what background knowledge they brought to bear on about this particular event. None of the historians were American historians. That was not their focus. They studied other parts of the world, just to get a sense of what content knowledge they brought to bear. And what he found was, perhaps not surprisingly, was that the historians read the documents better than the high school students. Surprise, surprise, the professionals win, and they gave Sam a PhD for figuring that out. What was more important about Sam's research, though, was that there was a very distinct way in which the historians read the document, that there was very clear patterns across all of them. And so what I'd like to do is show you just a brief excerpt from one of the interviews with a historian that is representative of the ways in which the historians engage with the documents. And so this is how Fred, who is a medievalist, read the documents. Fred did not do very well on that quiz from the back of the textbook. He got 30% right on the quiz, so he was sort of stuck in the Middle Ages. He did not have a lot of content knowledge, but his reading of the document was similar to all the other historians. So this is how he read the Barker document. And so this is from the transcript. He says, 19th at 2 o'clock, we began our march by wading through a very long ford up to our middle. Diary of John Barker, British, an officer, 19th, that's the day itself. Okay, waiting, it must have been cold, April 2. Oh yeah, they're gonna be wet, cold. You come out of Boston, you have to cross the what? The James? The Charles? What do you notice about what Fred is doing here? What is Fred seem to be doing as he's reading that Barker document? Context, yeah, so he's immediately thinking about the context in which this document took place, right? He's thinking about the personal context of these soldiers being wet and cold. What else?
Sourcing the day itself.
Good, so he immediately is looking at the source information. He's noticing it's the day itself, right? So he's already read some other documents, so he has, despite getting 30% right, he has some other information already about this event. So this is not the first document he's read. So he says, oh, it's the day itself. So yeah, he's sourcing it. Good. Other things we notice.
Placing it geographically.
Yeah, his geography's a little shaky. He knows it's a British monarch. He thinks James first. It's a little further south, but he gets the Charles River eventually, right? So yeah, he's placing it geographically. Good. Anything else you notice?
There's some emotion to it, right?
Good. Yes, trying to get a sense of what would be the feeling of Barker, right? Good. All right. So here's how he continues in the reading of the document. Entry for April 19th from the diary of Lieutenant John Barker, an officer in the British Army. We all know about diaries. 19th, he wrote it that day. Maybe. Cover his backside. Better that he lost control over his men than to have ordered the first shot. Useful in an inquest. What do you notice here?
Motivation.
Yeah, he's immediately thinking about the motivation of Barker. What is Barker's motivation in writing this document? Good. What else? Yeah.
Just like considering the purpose of a diary, especially from like a military personnel, of like, you probably didn't write it that day, but you do need this just in case you get called to testify or questions about it.
Good, so he's thinking also about genre, right? He's thinking about what kind of document is this and what's the purpose of that particular kind of document as well. Next.
he's
Yeah.
adding his own background knowledge.
Good, yes, so, also bringing to bear his own, right, his own perspective as a historian and the knowledge that he has as a result of that work. Where has he spent all his time thus far with the document? Yeah, the date, right? The source information, right? He cared deeply about the source, which is what all of the historians did and almost none of the high school students did. The historians cared deeply about where did this document come from? When was it written? Why? What was the purpose? In contrast, most of the high school students read from the top of the document to the bottom of the document, and in many cases, they skipped over the attribution entirely. It was an italic to the bottom. I could probably get away without reading that stuff, right? And so that was what Sam saw, was that over and over again, that there were very distinct moves that the historians made. And so these were what we have defined as our historical figures. So the first one is that Fred and all the historians engaged in sourcing. They looked at the source information, that they placed the documents into context. We do not see it as much here, but you see as they read multiple documents, they're corroborating. They're looking for points of similarity and difference across the documents. And then they engage in close reading, which is not necessarily totally discipline specific, but it is certainly a move we see the historians engaging. And so what Brad and Sarah are passing around is our historical thinking chart. So we moved from the research that Sam did into trying to develop curriculum materials that emphasize these historical thinking skills, moves that historians use when they engage with evidence, and being very clear in articulating what those are so that students can also engage in them. They will not do it automatically. Historians don't do it automatically. They've been taught to do it. And so that's what we have structured the curriculum around, is helping students to do that work. And so you'll see that there's that column of questions, and those are the questions we want students to ask when they engage with historical documents. Who wrote this? Why was it written? When was it written? Is it believable? Why or why not? We want them to place the document, we want them to corroborate, look for points of similarity and difference across documents. And importantly, we want them also to notice what is missing, to articulate the absence. What is the other document we want? The person who said, Leslie saying, I wish I had a letter, right? What is the other perspective you want in order to better answer a question? And to place them into context. This is by far the most intellectually challenging of the historical thinking skills, because it requires both having content knowledge, but then also applying that content knowledge onto the document. So thinking about the context in which the document was created, but then also thinking about how that document, that context, influences the content of the document. It's easy to say, oh, this was happening around right before the revolution begins, but it's very different to think about how do those various layers influence what Barker's saying. There's big social political context of the ongoing conflict, the Boston Massacre, but there's also a personal context of he's wet and cold and he is afraid that he's going to get in trouble, and all of those layers of context influence the document. And then finally, close reading. We were all doing that very readily this morning, right, of noticing to our knowledge, no one on our side fired. Looking at the word choices that the authors have made. What was their intent in doing it? What's the evidence that the author used? And why would they be doing it? What was their purpose in phrasing the documents in those ways as they created this particular account? We will see that these are frequently referenced in the curriculum. We will, after we come back from lunch, we'll share with you the other materials that go along with the Lexington lesson that we didn't use this morning because we wanted to go through it a little quicker with a group of and we'll also spend more time unpacking the lesson and talking and reflecting a little bit more on its implementation, but I do not want to be the person that stands between you and lunch. So it is 11:58 right now. We're going to reconvene at 12:45 back in here, and we're going to talk with Carrie, who's the head of STF, about the collaboration over the course of the year for a little bit before we dive into more about the